Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. I'm Karen Coney, the director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School. And on behalf of the VLC and BAC, Basis for Actuele Kunst in Utrecht, Netherlands, I am thrilled to welcome you to As for Protocols, to hold things together. This two-day symposium is unfolding today and tomorrow in various constellations with artists, scholars, scientists, and activists who we have worked with over the years, discussing, how to hold things together. In these times of the pandemic, but also of violent neo-colonial occupations, at the moment, especially the Middle East, if we have learned anything, it's that we're all connected, that the hyperlocal is resonant with global developments, and vice versa, that transnational occurrences manifest themselves locally in our most intimate relationships. In that sense, we at the Vera List Center feel that we are just one node of many in a rich and vibrant network of related institutions, organizations, and individuals dedicated to advancing the political agency of art and examining what spaces of political engagement can be created through artistic practices. In all this work for many years, we have traveled alongside BAC. Like the VLC, BAC is a center for public scholarship. Like the VLC, BAC offers classes, publications, and artist fellowships, and its renowned public programs have staked out some of the crucial problematics of our time, always with prescience, precision, and care. There are differences too. BAC has an extraordinary exhibition program for one, but today we want to focus on the possibilities and promise of such alignments and push a little further into the opportunities for co-creation or co-production. To hold things together is the first example of this, and we couldn't be more pleased and grateful to have that moment of the collaboration with BAC finally arrived. At the Vera List Center, our programs are framed by two-year research topics. Starting last September, we've begun examining protocols for equitable engagement under the heading As for Protocols. To hold things together caps the first year of deep reflections on how to discover, unearth, create, and enact more equitable protocols. And I am convinced that we can only move closer to solidarity and collaboration when the proper protocols are in place. Recognizing that the local is distinct, even on Zoom, the first most basic protocol was clear to us. The Vera List Center would be the host and BAC our guest and the curator of To Hold Things Together. Rarely has there been a happier host than us, and it's been, I want to say, exemplary to see how BAC developed the programming, responding to our context, to the As for Protocols topic, and taking in Vera List Center fellows and artists we've worked with to join the cohort of stellar associates of BAC. However, our hosting extends to the setup of this symposium only. In my own life, I'm an immigrant to Manhattan in the Mansi language of the Lenape, very much a guest who arrived without invitation. In my work and at the Vera List Center, we are committed to remembering and fighting the legacies of settler colonialism and recognizing the indigenous nations who were here long before us. In the chat, you will find a link to a global map featuring indigenous nations, a particularly useful tool to locate yourself as we move through and within online spaces. It was put together by the Canadian nonprofit and indigenous-led organization, Native Land Digital. To this history of contentious arrivals and cohabitation, we will contribute to hold things together by focusing on modes of social and institutional modality. We will encounter protocols of solidarity in our hyperlocal and hyperdispersed existence. We will discuss real and speculative community and institutional models, and we will propose theoretical and practical elements of coalitional exchange in order to build aesthetic, poetic, and tactical forms of research, assembly, mobilization, and co-creation amid fraught unfolding realities. So much for the goals of our symposium. let me give you a brief overview. We will begin with the first panel entitled Affective Protocols of Locality. At 1 o'clock, after a brief intermission, the next panel is entitled On Artistic Coalition and Institutional Communal Modality. And at 6 o'clock, we're going to close today's day and deliberations with the conversation entitled There Lies the Road, a dialogue about making art in a good way. It is hosted by Oglala Lakota artist Suzanne Kite and involves an exchange among Indigenous and non-Indigenous thinkers, artists, and the general public on explorations of notions of ethics, protocols, and artificial intelligence. So after an afternoon break, I urge you to come back at 6 o'clock. Tomorrow at 11 o'clock, we're starting day 2, dedicated to spectral infrastructures and co-organized with Bach and Free Thought. Brief and much too brief notes of thanks to you all, our audience, for joining us, to our extraordinary speakers, to Bach, in particular, Maria Hlavajova, the General and Artistic Director, and Rachael Rakes, the Curator of Public Practice, and their large team, some of whom you will meet in the chat or here on Zoom. At the Vera List Center, I'd like to acknowledge the curatorial leadership of Ariola Pira, our curator, and I'd also like to express deep appreciation to Adrian Ume, Assistant Director of Operations, and Wen Zhuang, Assistant Director of Editorial Initiatives. The VLC's programs are currently made possible by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Arts, the Ford Foundation, the Kettering Fund, the Sigurd Rousing Trust, as well as the members of the Vera List Center board. Bach's participation is made possible through the financial contributions of the Dutch Ministry for Education, Culture and Science and the municipality of Utrecht. Just a word on the logistics, the practicalities. In the chat, we will paste bios for all the speakers. I also want to point out that the proceedings are being recorded. So unless you, or if you'd rather not be registered, just turn off your camera. We're providing ASL and closed caption interpretations, and I would like to thank our partners in providing those services very much. The panel, the first panel again, now opening, is Affective Protocols of Locality. And just want to mention that we're basically returning to the beginnings of my few remarks, pointing out that the pandemic has renewed conditions for rethinking localized and situated practices. We're now revisiting proximity and communal artistic labor for collectives, institutions, and less formalized groups. The speakers in this section are in order of their appearance, Maria Hlavajova and Rachael Rakes. They will be followed by Mitchell Esajas of the Black Archives in Amsterdam. Elizabeth Povinelli will follow them with representing the Karrabing Film Collective from the Northern Territories of Australia. And we're closing the presentations in the first panel with Norberto Roldan, who is representing the Green Papaya projects in Manila. And I think with that, we're good to go. Thank you again very much for joining. And here is Maria and Rachael.
Thank you so very much, Karin. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this introduction and for this wonderful collaboration. And I indeed look forward to many more to come. Of course, my thanks to all our colleagues at the Vera List Center for Arts and Politics and here at Bach, and in particular to Rachael Rakes, of course, to all our wonderful speakers, the interpreters, and all of you who joined this session today, and I hope stay with us today for the whole day and tomorrow. As we are going to speak about coalitionality and solidarity and alliances today, I would like to start by saying that Bach, Basis voor Actuele Kunst in Utrecht, stands in solidarity with the Palestinian decolonization struggle and with decolonization struggle and efforts everywhere. Now, I hope to begin this panel with few prompts, really, merely prompts on locality and nodality from an institution perspective, the way we've been thinking about it at BUC. And I'm going to start with sharing my screen. Speaking of locality, where better to start at the closed door of our institution of BUC in the city of Utrecht, behind which a remarkable exhibition of works by Kader Attia waits for the public opening. We really hope this will be possible soon. But nonetheless, I thought to begin from here. It's a multifaceted project called Fragments of Repair, which besides this exhibition also extends to Paris with the project La Colonie Nomade, which is a collective study program, a continuation of La Colonie in nomadic modality, if you will, after it has been forced to close down its venue due to COVID-19 pandemic. And then the third part, Fragments of Repairs, gatherings with hybrid off and online discursive meetings. And the project, importantly, is conceptualized as an archive of knowledges on decolonial repair, proposing decolonial repair as a way to engage with the planetary urgencies of collective mental health in a world wounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. All right, I would like to share with you today at the beginning of our conversation, just three sets of remarks, three sets of notes. And the first one I would like to start from is the notion of instituting otherwise. BUC in brief is an art institution that works from the conditions of the world today. It is theoretically informed, if you will, and politically driven, or in other words, driven by the urgencies that shape conditions of life at present. Now, true to its name, to its full name, that is, it functions as a base, as a basis, situated at a convergence of artistic practice, knowledge production, and social action. It inhabits, one could say, entanglements, a variety of entanglements among the practices that one could simply refer to as thinking how things are, imagining how things could be otherwise, and then seeking ways to contribute collectively to materialization of these alternative imaginaries, or in other words, enacting, practicing, and living these alternative imaginaries as if that were possible. Now, this notion of instituting otherwise, the instituting otherwise, presupposes solidarity with a community of cultural practices and forms of life which, driven by a deep disenchantment with the conditions of the collapsing world, holds the institution to account and under pressure to always newly start again. Now, this idea of having to always newly start again gains, in my view, renewed urgency in the new age of pandemics. For it asks us to envision institutional ways that would accommodate at once the hyperlocality and hyperdispersion of life today. A negotiation that I believe is different than from local versus global, to put things very simplistically and bluntly, that dominated our institutional work over the last few decades. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic alone, disruptive as it has been, however, is not the eventual disruption in the process of instituting otherwise. For a prompt for de-instituting and consequent re-instituting in another modality must come in a form of an artistic proposition, or better yet, mainly through propositions that emerge from alliances of artistic practice, social movement, and the institution itself. In this view, instituting otherwise is not so much about the institution than about creating conditions for inquiring into and rehearsing around the question how to be together otherwise. Let me just bring you to such a artistic proposition around this question how to be together otherwise. This proposition emerged from a concrete project, as you can see, that we convened with artist Janne van Heijswijk under this name in 2019-2020, and which was conceived as, and I quote, an exhibition as a series of trainings for a future of being together otherwise. While one could visit trainings for the not yet as an exhibition in its own right, it was really conceived as a training ground, to use Jeanne's terminology of radical collective pedagogy, with daily self-convened intensive community trainings. The works then should be understood less as artworks and more like learning objects or repositories of community knowledges with which to prepare collectively for the not yet. A crucial learning object in this context was this project, Radicalizing the Local, which is essentially a three-dimensional diagram that narrates the struggle for the right to live well in the Afrikaanderwijk neighborhood of Rotterdam. It shows essentially a process of building a collaborative political economy by bringing together informal culture and economic practices of the everyday into a new organizational form on the scale of the neighborhood. This solidarity-driven initiative still operates today, albeit not without gigantic challenges. As a proof that models of being together otherwise are possible, in spite of today's political economic reality, which presents itself as one without alternatives. However, a parallel conversation ensued around this work when we realized that under the rubric of the local, Jeanne has put in motion an immense sweeping process of invitation and interconnection of hundreds of practitioners, groups, and communities from not merely the city of Utrecht, where we are situated, but from across the world. Jeanne readily offered her definition of the local, which, to be sure, has little to do with confined neighborhoods or a shared postal code. Rather, the local is an emotional, affective, and perhaps even ideological condition. A condition which holds us together and which replicates across various topologies of all sorts, across geographies, times, practices, movements, disciplines, and so forth. Now, in this age of pandemics, it has become obvious how important this understanding of locality through its nodal expression, through its replication in nodes elsewhere, how important this might be for the future of an art institution such as ours. For it helps to draft a pathway around or beyond the local that has already been barricaded with multiple meanings historically and in the present, as a composition fragmented into contestatory enclaves of difference, coalition, and resistance to neoliberal globalization and the violences it brings along, but which, as much as it is enabling alternative networks, nurturing the community and environment, is also a key contemporary interface of racial and extractivist capitalism. And I mean the politics of location that has to do with intensifying sense of identity belonging, nationalist grounding, anti-immigration sentiment, border enforcement, and up to rising fascism at present. There are two key learnings that we took from this experience in the Bach's process of instituting, and which I think may be useful for our conversations in the course of these 2 days. The otherwise and elsewhere. Now, the notion of the otherwise very much inspired by Elisabeth Povinelli, who is in this session with us, and who prompted us to think during her remarkable lecture at Bach on propositions for non-fascist living, to think the difference between the otherwise on one hand and the dialectic of the self and the other that constitutes much of the world today. The otherwise is what refuses to be one or the other in Elisabeth's words. And in my view, offers us a space for not merely revolt and critique, but for proposition, for alternative imagining and enacting. And then the elsewhere. Year and a half into the COVID-19 pandemic, we now see the virus operating as an avid multiplier of not just itself, but every injustice it encounters, continuing to reveal deep-seated wounds across the globe. These wounds issue from the nexuses of historical colonialisms and present-day authoritarianisms, economic disparities, and growing racial violence, and the continuous abuses inflicted upon already vulnerable, precarious lives and increasingly frequent climate disasters. Now, if these underpinnings of the politics of locality have already been there, the current pandemic has propelled them into persistent viscerality or visceral proximity, as Judith Butler has noted in one of her talks lately. The pandemic shows us, or makes us feel even, that what's happening elsewhere happens here. And thus, in the words of Judith Butler, we are interacting even when we imagine ourselves to be distant from one another. Let's say via breathing as my breath enters your body. Whether voluntarily or not, we are implicated into one another. This shows not merely our vulnerability, but the interdependent characteristic of our embodied lives. And we depend upon the organization of interdependence. I leave it here and offer the word to Rachel, my colleague at Papaya.
Hello, and thanks so much to Karen and Roldan, everyone. I will briefly transition from the conversation around Van Heeswyck, Trains for the Not Yet, and the invocations of locality and modality that Maria has put forth, into also thinking about some production we've been doing more behind the scenes as an institution this past year. Van Heeswyck's idea of radicalizing the local necessarily probes the question of what kind of local support systems we can build right here and now, wherever that here and now may be. This practice, she writes, reinforces the building of complex patterns and systems of change through relatively small interactions. To this, we add the necessity to think about situatedness, which implies positionality and is thus intrinsically relational. So if locality attends to an identity, situatedness attends to an affinity. Donna Haraway in Simeon's Cyborgs and Women discusses the difficulties of political alliances brought about by a focus on identity alone, and how this undoes collective action by ignoring issues of interlocking systems of oppression across time and space. Here she writes, also echoing Chela Sandoval, identity marks out a self-consciously constructed space that cannot affirm the capacity to act on the basis of natural identification, but this occurs only on the basis of a conscious coalition, of affinity, of political kinship. The idea of situatedness, embedded with affinity, then can be a rooting point for coalition, which, if seen in all of its mobilizing potential, folds together the here, the elsewhere, the otherwise. And I'll share my screen now. To move to decolonial feminist scholar Maria Lugones, who writes in her book, Pilgrimage, Peregrinajes, how much and what sort of agency do we need to move with others without falling into a politics of the same, a politics that values or assumes sameness or homogeneity, without mythologizing place, attempting to stand in the cracks and intersections of multiple histories of domination and resistances to domination. The voluntary interlocal network of situated knowledges and politics through affinity might attempt to inhabit some of the space in those cracks and intersections. From the situation of interpandemic times in particular, we've begun thinking about what institutional elements could be modified, what models might encourage or resemble constellating coalition. I'll touch on a few of them with the caveat that none of these are proven, so to speak. They're all in becoming, and none are meant to be seen as institutional posturing or solutions, but simply some attempts at tactics. The first has been to reform Bach's fellowship, now called the Fellowship for Situated Practice, to engage with a pandemic problem, an art establishment problem, and a coalitional problem at once. We've organized the participation according to cells, such that rather than a group of international practitioners assembling together at Bach, smaller groups work at times autonomously at times in community, from within different local situations, and then through research, artistic, and political affinities. The nodes of this year will be in Utrecht, Istanbul, Jakarta, including a partnership with Good School, who will speak at the next panel, and then a digital node for a group of practitioners whose locality could best be defined as online, who reside in changing radical digital space. These groups are convened along with the collective Free Thought and with a conceptual focus for this year on spectral infrastructure, which will be elaborated on in tomorrow's seminars. The reformation of the fellowship is meant to not only address limitations to travel and the generally poor previous form of art world constant mobility and putative presence, but also to provide support and to listen to each other long term, comparing struggles and situations from within them. The second one we'll touch on is the development of what we're calling a community portal. This builds on ongoing efforts to directly support and engender the knowledges already happening locally beside the institution. Rather than bringing artistic practices to communities or vice versa, specific community practices are portaled into the institution and from the institution as a parallel interweaving efforts both on and offline. The infrastructure of the community portal comes about in a curriculum of public learnings. These are practices, tools, methods, and protocols defined by terms of engagement that go multiple ways. The portal then becomes the body of Bach civic practice with the community in residence at Bach and with its programmatic and administrative infrastructure. As an element of the institution, this is a concrete endeavor with legible forms, a residency, publishing, the diagramming and dissemination of research, but also looks to become a metonymy of how an institution might try to operate and commune with local groups in a situated way. As a final example, when we closed physically last year, one pressing thing to consider was how to enact solidarity within these new enclosures. This became the first focus of an online forum, Prospections, which launched in April 2020, with the first focus being on technical solidarities. While hosting writing on reports about local solidarities, we also found small ways to use the platform and Bach's institutional status as a network for providing small amounts of material support to those who are doing critical groundwork. Our event series, Practicing Tactical Solidarities, attempts to convene relief and support networks in different parts of the world, while also engendering coalition by connecting these efforts in conversation and comparison of needs and struggles. Ongoingly, it's the aim of the forum to not only circulate prospective ideas, but to find creative ways of supporting their actualization. The current focus of Prospections, How to Assemble Now, looks at mutating forms and needs of assembly in a moment where international solidarity, where the real co-identification of what has seemed previously like localized struggles is visibly taking shape. And I will end there and pass it on to Mitchell. Thank you.
Thanks for the inspiring presentations, Maria and Rachel. My name is Mitchell, co-founder of the Black Archives, and I was asked to share some of my thoughts and our work as well, and prepared a short presentation. So I'm going to share my screen. Bear with me for a sec. Okay, should be able to see my screen now. And don't worry, I'm not going to use all 296 slides, just about 20. So what I'd like to do is really share some of the work that we do. The Black Archives is a very practice-based grassroots organization informed by theories of the Black radical tradition, decolonial theory, but really try to translate theoretical ideas and debates to practical solutions and practical activities. And yeah, in relation to the theme of today, I thought it would be nice and important to share a bit about our history as well, how it came about, and yeah, how it started. Especially because I realized that in a few weeks, in June, it will be exactly 10 years ago that we started. And when I say we, I mean the Black Archives, which arose out of an organization called New Urban Collective. And this started in 2011, June 9th, 2011 to be exact, as a student association focused on Black students and graduates based in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, because there were not that many organizations organizing around issues that Black people in the Dutch context face. So we started organizing all kinds of events, like lectures, debates, around the urgencies that the students from our network and our communities really felt were important. So to give a few examples, this was one of the first events that we organized in November 2011. And it was supposed to be a debate about multiculturalism in the Dutch context, but it happened to be organized just a few days after a protest was organized, a protest about one of the most popular Dutch traditions, St. Nicholas. Some of you may have heard about it, that it includes some racist elements, people dressing up in blackface. And in hindsight, this event, the specific action, became a catalyst for a impactful social movement. So over the past 10 years, especially since this, I could call it historical moment, a movement against racism based on this specific tradition arose. And in 2011, there were only two people, these two guys, Jeremy and Quincy, active in this protest, and it grew to a few thousand over the last year. So in parallel to that, the growth of that movement, our organization grew, our thinking grew, and the way we organize grew and developed as well. As I said, we've also always been very practice-based. I have a background in anthropology and business administration myself. And we've done a lot of research about inequality in the educational system. In Amsterdam, for example, you see that there are large inequalities between different neighborhoods, especially neighborhoods where large numbers of people with a migrant background live, people where a lot of Black people live, such as Amsterdam Southeast. So yeah, besides studying and debating the issue, we try to be active in the community. So one of the things we set up was a mentoring program in which we coached primary school children towards making a very, very important exam, which is very, which determines the level of secondary education they will be tracked into at a young age. So one of the sayings that really informed the way we think and try to operate is a West African proverb. It takes a village to raise a child. Especially since we live in a very individualized, neoliberal, capitalistic society and system. We try to see how, as a collective, a grassroots organization, can still share resources, share knowledge to support one another. Another example is this project where we connected students and graduates with organizations so they could find jobs and internships, especially focus on students of color and graduates of color, because a lot of them were found it hard to find a job or internship due to labor market discrimination. organized mentoring programs, youth exchanges to London around Black history, campaigns around decolonizing the university. So as you can see, we were quite active. And all of that activity, the network that we developed throughout the years, you could say resulted in the Black Archives. Of course, we built this network of students, which grew into a larger community of all kinds of people, not just students, but also, working class people, academics who felt the same need, who felt the same urgency of being active around societal issues of inequality and racism, and also the lack of attention that was being given to Black perspectives in education. So in 2015, we were approached by a few guys, and I'm gonna speed up a little bit because of time. We were approached by these guys, Chemo and Miguel Halbron. Their father was Waldo Halbron, a sociology from Suriname, who worked in Amsterdam at the university. And we did a lot of research on the Dutch Caribbean, plantation economy, and the legacy of slavery. But besides that, he was also very critical about how history is being written and how history informs people's identity, sense of belonging, and how they feel part of a community. And one of the things he argued, especially looking at the Dutch educational system and cultural sector, he argued that often history, national history, is being presented as if there is a neutral national history. He was very critical about that, though. So he argued that history can also be seen as a reconstruction of the past, and I think a lot of us will be familiar with the fact that certain parts of history are often erased or marginalized, silenced, especially the histories of colonialism, histories of slavery, and its legacy. Definitely in the Dutch context, that is the case. And as an anthropologist and sociologist, he also looked at how that erasure influences how people develop their identity and how they relate to certain communities, and how that fuels inequality and exclusions, mechanisms of exclusion within society. Unfortunately, he passed away, and when he passed away, he left behind quite a large collection of books. So his sons inherited that collection, and they ended up approaching us, and together with them, we found a place where we could make this collection available to our network, our collective, or our community, because we knew that people were very interested in this literature and this information, but often it was relatively hard to find these kinds of perspectives, this literature, this work at educational institutions and cultural institutions. So, as I said, we're very practice-based communities. Instead of just debating about it, we try to make it available in this temporary space in Amsterdam North. However, because of gentrification, we had to leave that space. We ended up moving after a few months. And when we had to move, we ended up in this building in Amsterdam East, which is owned by the Association of Surinamese People. It's the oldest association of migrant people, as far as I know, in the Netherlands. It's 102 years old, set up in 1919. So there's a very interesting history of working as a collective, as an association as well. This is how we found the space when we started there in January 2016. As you can see, it was quite messy. So we made a deal where we said, hey, we can help you clean up if you can put our books there, without having any idea what was in those boxes. But whilst cleaning up, we found out that there was a lot of interesting information hidden in those boxes. And looking back, we call the way that we were community archiving, because we're not professionally trained archivists. Only later on we learned that it's like an actual profession and sector, but we are archiving. Together with volunteers, students, people who are interested in the material, we continuously try to develop methods and ways to make this information, this knowledge accessible and visible in a society that in which this history and its legacy is often erased. So these are just a few examples. I won't show too much because of time, but especially since I think we have a few people from New York looking, found the New York Times, or a few New York Times from the 1950s with articles about the civil rights movement. A few Ebony magazines, Time magazines from the 1950s, 60s. The book in the middle may be interesting for some of the people in the audience. It's a book by Langston Hughes with some of his personal notes. So when we found these items, we realized that it's not just some, just some random, just a few random books, but it was quite an exceptional collection. This is what it looks like now. So, as you can see, we did quite some work. And finding out about these items and the history behind some of these items, we asked ourselves, how can we make it available to our community? And with our community, we meant our families, our youths, the kids we mentor, the people who are part of our movement. And we realized that our community is, a broad community consisting not just of students and highly educated people. We wanted to make it available to a broader audience. I'm the first in my family to go to university, but I want my family members to be able to access this fascinating material and information as well. So we decided to work with artists because we realized that art can be a very important way to convey information, to share information, to also to touch people in an emotional, not just an intellectual way. So together with several artists, we've been developing exhibitions based on the archival research that we do. And based on the archival material that we find, we also try to collect oral histories of people who are still alive and who are actually part of the history that we found in the archive. So these are just a few examples of exhibitions we developed. This one was about the Black radical couple, Otto and Hermie Huishout, born in Suriname and Guyana. Otto was the only Black co-founder of the Communist Party, traveled all around the world, and ended up in Amsterdam at this association. So we have their collection. And we try to tie this history to the present moment by showing that what is happening now, this movement against Sotopiet and this movement against racism is not necessarily something new, but can be seen as a larger and longer history of radical organizing against inequality. I think I'm going to skip a few slides because of time. But what we do is that we operate on the intersection of art, activism, archiving, and societal debate. This is when Angela Davis visited us a few years ago. This is from our current exhibition about the history of the association, which was 100 years old. So when the pandemic hit, if I have to be honest, it worked out quite well for us because as a grassroots organization, we were not a formalized and structurally financed institution. So we've been doing a lot of hard work over the years, leading to burnouts and people being extremely tired. So we took the moment literally to rest, to reflect, and to, you know, tone it down a little bit. And over the past year, you know, we've been thinking, especially the people who suffered from burnout, about, you know, how our work, activism, resistance, and tying it to art, you know, can be unhealthy. You know, the social impact has been great, but it has not been sustainable the way that we've been working. So we've been trying to use the time to rethink the way we work, and in the post-pandemic period, we hope to find a more sustainable way to operate. I'm going to try to go a little bit faster and conclude. So we've been organizing or producing podcasts, one every month, in which we, you know, still try to collect histories and share information with our community. And last year in June, when the Black Lives Matter protest or the George Floyd was murdered in the US, we came together with different people in our community and decided to organize a solidarity protest with the people in the US, but also to address the anti-Black violence happening in the Netherlands and the EU. And it became a historical moment. Thousands and thousands of people showed up, as you can see on these pictures, in every province of the Netherlands, which had never happened before. More than 50,000 people showed up at these protests. So we realized it was a very historical moment. And we used that moment to bring people together in a community to develop a manifesto, which includes our vision on social change. And in this process, I'm very happy to say that Buck, you know, showed up as a partner, showed solidarity by sharing resources, and making it possible to develop an open call for artists and writers to not just to reflect on the manifesto and develop work on it. And based on that open call, we aim to develop an exhibition which should be opened later this year. And the open call to us is also a way of supporting artists who have been struggling over the past year due to the pandemic. So Maria started with it, I'll end with it. I think it is imperative and essential that we continue to speak out, show up, show solidarity, especially now, in this during the time of the pandemic. It has become very clear how different forms of colonial violence are interconnected, and in our own way, we try to show solidarity with the people in Palestine, people in the US, and people across the world. So thanks for listening to us, and I think we'll continue in the Q&A in a minute.
Hi, thank you. That was really amazing. My name is Elizabeth Povinelli, and I am going to say something very simple, I think, and straightforward this afternoon. That is in the context of the thematic of this morning's panel. And the simple thing I want to say is that finding oneself obligated to others, or finding oneself in a relation of mutual love and commitment and respect, doesn't abrogate how the infrastructures of difference and differentiation embrace us. And I'm going to try and just give some examples of what I mean through our work together as in the Karrabing Film Collective, of which I'm a part. And I am speaking on both on behalf, but also within the Karrabing Film Collective. Everyone else is asleep because it's the middle of the night in Northern Australia. And also just to get at the differential distributions of representation and communication, they also live in a small, somewhat rural community with very limited communication infrastructures. So that's something also that's on the table and we have to think and talk about. But so let me say just some very quick things about the Karrabing Film Collective. It's a family-based art and film collective that began around 2009 when a very violent event happened on their birth community, a small indigenous community named Belyuen, which is right across the Darwin Harbor at the top of Australia in the Northern Territory. And this event left about 50 people homeless. That is, they left the community. And I could go into very intimate detail about the conditions that's created this violent event. But let me just say very quickly that it was lit by the intersection of two forms of settler colonial governance of indigenous lives and worlds. On the one hand, a form of liberal recognition or the liberal states' recognition of indigenous self-determination, which worked to divide indigenous groups based on a very old, very conservative social anthropological model in which a clan owned a land through a totem or dreaming. And then in 2007, this form of, quote, recognition, which was really a form of division and alignment, attempt to align indigenous worlds with Western forms of property and proprietariness, met a neoliberal forms of extractive capitalism, and it blew up the community. It severed relations amongst families in the community, and about 50 people, adults and children, became homeless. They left. I'm going to put in I just put it in, put into the chat our website where you can go and look at the full range of things that we're doing now. Because I want to just really be brief in order to get to the very simple thing I want to say around affective protocols. But one other thing to say about Karrabing is that it's a word and a concept. It's a word in ME, Yangal, which is a language, indigenous language, that refers to when the salt water is at its lowest and about to come back to shore. And it's paired with Katakal, which is when the tide's at the highest and it's about to go out to sea. Both are great conditions. One's not bad or low, and one's high in a kind of English sense. They're both, you can do different things. But it's also a concept, and it's a concept that these 50 people who suffered the violence of the settler mindset of indigenous relation to country as property and proprietariness wanted to foreground. And the concept is that the respect for individual lands, individual totemic relations, individual environments doesn't work unless you begin with the interdependencies across those lands and seas and totemic worlds. Cecilia Lewis, who is an Emmy Engel elder in the group, has said in a triptych we did for the Art Gallery of New South Wales that for her and the other members of Karrabing as a concept foregrounds two things. One, that everyone in the group has their own land, their own language, their own stories. But these stories, these lands, and these languages didn't emerge first as one's own and then were connected. They emerged from the long totemic history of events that entangled them or created interdependencies amongst them that provided the conditions for where one's own is. So first came the interdependencies as a condition of having one's own. And thus Karrabing is a collection of 3 language groups, about 9 totemic groups, and the vast waters that shape the Anson Bay in the north, the southwest of from Darwin. And indeed, although we're officially the Karrabing Film Collective, we actually consider ourselves the Karrabing mob. Why is this important? If we're trying to think about the affective nature, the protocols of trying to be and work together. Well, on the one hand, it's very important to start by saying there are differences amongst the collective, which is about 30 to 50 people. Everyone, we could start and say everyone is indigenous in the group and from these coastal regions, except me. But that said, it would be really, I think, quite wrong, and people in the group, when I'll talk about this later, have worked against this idea that there's a homogeneous indigenous group and then Beth, right? And instead, what Karrabing does in our art, in our film, is show the very interestingly different positions within Karrabing based on religion, based on heritage, based on totems, based on social life histories. And we do this, and everyone wants to do this because, like the concept Karrabing, it's important to say you don't all have to be the same and to be together. And indeed, this idea of creating homogeneity as the basis of a political, social, environmental world is a proprietary one. Instead, the practices that need to be developed are ones in which one is different and connected. One has one's own history, one's own set of very, strong argumentative positions, but we stay together. We try and think about how, if we're going to be what we are, we have to learn how to allow others to be what they are, connected. The same way a totem is able to stay in its place because of the way it's connected to a whole other set of spaces. With these differences, of course, both me as a settler and the indigenous members, but also within the indigenous members of the group, there are some very deep connections amongst us, and including me, that really we began to talk about when I first showed up in the Darwin region in 1984, and then was invited onto the Belleune community soon afterwards to work for them, doing grant writing and stuff. As a philosopher, not an, I didn't know an anthropologist, we won't go down that today. The connectivities I've talked about now in a graphic memoir that is out and you can read, and also a film that is harder to find and is not quite out yet. But the connectivities has to do, and again, I'm not going to go into detail, these connectivities have to do with my own Povinelli family relation to a village or a subnational area just nestled in what is now the Italian Alps, but has since, whenever, been a frontier between competing empires and nation states. And in my village, Povinellis have clans. So I'm a Simonox Povinelli. And thus, when I first got to Australia, we immediately started talking about what it is like to have a different mode of belonging to a place that's subnational, that's family-based, clan-based, right? And I also grew up and being both dispossessed, right? But in my Povinelli family's case, also a dispossessing force. That is, as we move from those Alps into the US, my family, though poor and dispossessed by states and empires, move into a space that has been dispossessed. So from both in the history of the Black Atlantic and colonial dispossession. All of this is to say that by the time we started the Karrabing Film Collective, or Karrabing, in 2009, we had known each other for a very long time, very intimately, with a very long conversation about things that deeply connected us, that resonated amongst us. A comfort growing up in the woods, but also a deep conversation about the fact that no matter how much we could, truly love each other in the way in which it's real, like you can fight, right? And in the way in which at some point, maybe a generation in, say, the 1800s, and my Povinelli clan and their Karrabing clans could have been similar. Nevertheless, the infrastructures of colonialism and racism differentially embraced us, powering through white supremacy. My family pulled into that, right? Elevating one while dispossessing the other. So for all the ways in which one might find oneself obligated, one might find oneself suddenly at home in an affiliated way, one cannot set up protocols, we think, around art collectives or any kind of political artistic collective, unless one also always takes into consideration and puts in the forefront in some ways the way in which these infrastructures of racism and colonialism don't care about our feelings at all. They will continually treat us differently, piling wealth and resources in one place as they suck it out of others. So when we went to make our protocol, so literally our Karrabing, we're a corporation, so we have a corporate, rules. We put on there that it has to be a supra indigenous majority, that majority has to come from the coastal lands that characterize the connections between these about 9 groups, and that the purpose of the money we make from whatever we do, say the art and the films, has to go back into supporting the ancestral present and past that constitutes both the human, geographical, and more than human world there. And it also says that any non-Indigenous person who comes to the group has to bring resources rather than take them. That applies to me. That applies to me no matter that we've grown up together, no matter that, we're family, no matter what we feel about each other, no matter the affective relations we have, the protocols of this collectivity has to foreground those infrastructures of colonialism and racism if we're going to have any chance of turning the actual economic and social resources in a different direction, and thus participate, even if slightly, in a much broader, much more robust practice, global practice, or attempt to decolonize the world. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Shoot them dead.
Dito sa gera na bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Gera ng bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Dito sa gera na bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Gera ng bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Hindi nyo man ang baki nilalaha, hindi naman alam ang pangalan ha. Para makabot sa inyong kota, sila sa bambang, puro pera lang nagpapa-ikot-ikot, parang ibo-ibo sa dibdib. Ang takot na tinitibin, ang sambayan ng kinikiti. Ang sariling bahay ko hindi naligtas, pilit ang pinapali ang saligang batas. Si Barabbas na sa taas, binawaldas ang tapang salat para sa agendang ano. Kaya bangat, kaya ba lumuluha ang lansangan? Hindi ba kaya naitigil na lamang sa gera na bulag? Ano ba ang amilangan? Ay, chicken pie, kada kanto. Chicken pie, kada ulo. Minsan solo, minsan tandem, kada lang modus. Yun daw ang utos ng kanilang pangulo. Tama bang kumitil ng kapwa? Tama bang walang hustisya? Walang pag-iimbestiga? Kalabit kalimot ang moda? Hindi nyo nga alam ang pangalan, tirahan, pamilya ilan, mga umuulan na luha. Malamig na bang kayang papatakan? Gera na bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Gera na bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Dito sa gera na bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Gera na bulag, ano ba pangalan ko? Tinitan na lang ang hinihiling, pagbigyan naman na kami ay ilibing. Kayo'y naghanap buhay, libo-libo ang patay, 50,000 bago nyo kami hinihimlay. Hindi na nga sapat ang kinikita namin, liwanag di makita na nakawin nyo pa sa amin. Asaan inyong hiya o inyong respeto? Mga tao rin kami, mga tao rin kami, mga tao rin kami. Hindi nyo ba nakita? Mga tao rin kami, mga tao rin kami. Hindi nyo ba naramdaman? Mga tao rin kami. Hindi nyo ba naririnig? Mga tao rin kami, mga tao rin kami.
Mga tao din kami.
Thank you. Thank you for screening my video, and thank you for having me here today. The heading of my talk is Artists Fight Back, Working with Art Communities in a Politically Hostile Environment. That video is a collage of images, sound, and music from various protest actions in Manila since 2016. The video represents various progressive art organizations like the Concerned Artists of the Philippines, Artist Alliance for Genuine Land Reform and Rural Development, and RESBAC, or Respond and Break the Silence Against the Killings. These are organizations which Green Papaya work and stand in alliance with. The Concerned Artists of the Philippines was founded in 1983 at the height of the protest movement against the Marcos regime to fight for freedom of expression. Artist Alliance for Genuine Land Reform and Rural Development, organized recently in 2017, fights for the rights of farmers who are victims of centuries-old and oppressive feudal system in this country. RESBAC, or Respond and Break the Silence Against the Killings, is a network of artists from different disciplines who produce publications, organize film screenings, and produce videos for circulation on social media to protest the war on drugs. Inserted in the video is a selection of plain black and white posters. Green Papaya was to celebrate 20 years in May of 2020. But due to the pandemic, Green Papaya instead produced 20 posters to reflect not only what beleaguers our present society, but also on Papaya's 20 years as a community of cultural workers. Some posters were a tribute to our medical frontliners, while most criticized the Philippine government's ineffective responses to the pandemic. The poster campaign was inspired by Arundhati Roy's "The Pandemic is a Portal." Now, to move away from that video, please allow me to give a brief overview of Green Papaya. Donna Miranda and I founded Green Papaya in 2000 without a structure. We did not have a roadmap. We simply remained open to many possibilities. Along the way, a friend or a colleague would join us as a curator or as a program director and would take over the wheels and see where the ride would take us. Throughout the last 20 years, though, I have remained as artistic director. We eventually found our space colonized by overlapping communities of visual artists and video makers, of contemporary dancers and sound artists, and a mix of practitioners generating ruptures and combustions of non-media-based programs. Green Papaya developed into an independent initiative that supported and organized actions and propositions that explored tactical approaches to the production, dissemination, research, and presentation of contemporary art in various and cross-disciplinary fields. It provided a platform for intellectual exchange, sharing of information and resources, and artistic and practical collaborations among local and international artists. The 2000 Art Asia Pacific Almanac wrote, "Green Papaya stands out as Manila's most venerable artist-run space. Manila is likely to sustain its newfound vitality, and the art scene is maturing. Green Papaya is already transforming from an alternative art space into an alternative art institution." It was a nice compliment from Art Asia Pacific, but we did not aspire to become an institution. We resisted becoming an institution. We consciously wanted to keep our structure as fluid and flexible as it was, and it still is. To me, institutions are like big containers where the fruits of these independent artist-run initiatives can be gathered and brought to the global supermarket of ideas, maybe like where we are now. But we wanted to remain this fruit-bearing small tree in the farm, or simply remain a part of the supply chain of information and ideas. We are happy to have stayed this way throughout the years. Fast forward to 2016, President Rodrigo Duterte has carried out his war on drugs as soon as he became president in 2016. The Philippine National Police, encouraged by Duterte's militarist policy, has instigated and incited the killings in a campaign that could amount to crimes against humanity. That same policy was extended to include hundreds of arrests and killings of human rights advocates, labor leaders, peasants, activists, cultural workers, and artists until today. Since then, many artists in our community have joined forces with progressive people's organizations to mount protest actions against the government. Donna Miranda co-founded Artist Alliance for Genuine Land Reform and Rural Development and has since been active in the peasants movement. In March this year, I have taken an active role in organizing the Transnational Coalition for the Arts. Transnation, a global coalition, is a necessary and immediate response to the threats made against the lives and democratic freedom of our fellow artists and cultural workers in Asia. A few crucial events occurred during the last 12 months. Aside from the pandemic and the resulting lockdown, a fire destroyed our space on June 3 and caused damage to our archives. The Papaya project team, composed of 7 regular members, shifted to being a collective as a way to cope better with these situations, both emotionally and organizationally. But on the brighter side, Papaya has been enjoying unprecedented attention from international arts and cultural institutions, exemplified by our inclusion in the Art Review Power 100 list in 2020, and the recent launch of the Papaya Archive on the Asia Art Archive Hong Kong website last February. We hope that our modest contribution to the AAA website, as shown in our archival materials, will help in understanding how independent platforms like Green Papaya can survive through constant reinventions, reconfigurations, and collective transformations while remaining relevant. I wish to end this presentation by quoting Patrick Flores, curator and art historian and director of the Vargas Museum in the Philippines, from a short description he wrote about Green Papaya last year, and I quote, "Green Papaya exemplifies the type of space that works with a particular community of kindred practitioners and creates interdisciplinary programs animated by impulses different from those emanating from, let us say, the market or museums. Not totally isolated from institutions or typical economic systems, it nevertheless insists on a distinction that is by turns polemical, strategic, and political. This is the context from which Green Papaya draws its strength and conveys its energy to a hopefully broader public sphere. This is also why it must be supported in the light of the need of a cultural ecology to be exposed to a wide range of sympathies and expression. For charting a less trammeled path, convening coteries not commonly present in institutions, and refusing to follow tried and tested logics set by habits and conveniences, Green Papaya serves a constituency that is vital in ensuring the survival of a lively art world. Finally, it renders a more ample field of practice and mental landscape as it provides opportunities for experimentation, critique, and general speculation about art and the society in which it is entangled intricately. Green Papaya initiates consequences out of this critical relationship with perceived hegemonies, and from within incites its own circumstances. End of quote. And I thank you all very much for listening.
Thanks so much, Pee-wee and Elizabeth and Mitchell. I'm going to start off the conversation. I wanted to jump from Norberto, your discussion of the Arundhati Roy piece around the pandemic as portal from a little over a year ago. I'll read a brief part from that. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And you've touched on sort of some transitions and differences in your organizations and work over the past year, but I was wondering for any of you if you would like to maybe continue more on that and how maybe your thinking has changed in the past year, getting beyond maybe a binary of like crisis opportunity, but just thinking about how things have shifted.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for bringing me on board. I met Rachel 2 years ago, I think, in the Philippines. what I haven't mentioned is Green Papaya was preparing to close in May of 2021, this month. And so that the pandemic actually opened up another door for us to continue with our operation. So other than the pandemic, actually, the fire that broke into our space last June was another portal that was opened to us to continue our operation. We were lucky enough that maybe only about 30% of our archives were damaged from the fire. And so we were able to save as much as we could. And we were working on them, trying to complete the digitization process with the help of Asia Art Archive. And so, yes, the fire, all the tragedies that happened to us, deaths in our families from COVID and the pandemic, they all have opened doors for us. And as of the moment, we have put aside our plan to close. And so we've kept our options open.
I'm happy to say a couple of things. It's, you know, it's a really interesting question since, so most everybody is in Australia, and Australia has put a impenetrable dome around the country. So folks haven't been able to move, and some of the younger members of the collective really have liked to move and would have loved to like meet everyone because they get ideas about other anti-colonial, anti-race art collectives. On the other hand, we're all really happy that the COVID hasn't really come into the Northern Territory because the embodied consequences of the virus are well known now, and everyone was worried about the devastating effect it would have had. That said, it was, you know, we were having conversation when I was there from October through February about how the virus movement and emergence for the members really underlined a certain kind of attitude toward the more than human world and our relations to it. And Natasha Bigfoot Lewis and I were having a conversation. She's about 30. She's Emmy Engel through her mom and her dad. And she was talking about, you know, the way in which, and again, we say Betagut, and that means settler, but the way settler capitalism sees a space that doesn't have humans in it and thinks it's empty and wasted still today, rather than understanding that the geology has to have its own. It's not just lit life, but a formation has to have its own place if she and her family are going to be able to go there and have relations with that place. Some are eating, some are, you know, using the various both stone formation, reformation. So it's, for them, it's a way of not confirming, but further engaging how COVID is part of an ancestral catastrophe, not a coming one. That is a portal that might have opened up way in the past, and continually re-shows itself in these new forms in the present. And since in some ways all of our work is really not for art, it's for deepening this connection to the ancestral present and future, it's given people, you know, we just keep on making the world we're making out with their ancestors. So I think it's been, you know, interesting, to say the least. But that's really the conversation that's going on. But it's a very different context to much of the world because of how that government is like clamping. Is in some ways, I would say, our prime minister at the moment is like interested in maybe returning to a white Australia. I don't know. We don't know what this is enabling.
Yeah, very interesting thoughts, and I have to say, I'm very sorry to hear Norberto about what happened to your site and the archive. You know, as a person working in the archive, I think it's like our worst nightmare that such a thing, you know, would happen. So I hope you'll be able to find a solution. But in terms of the impact, how we've been thinking about, you know, this whole pandemic, I mentioned it briefly in my presentation. I didn't really delve into it. You know, one of the things that we've been thinking about is some of the work of a lady called Trisha Hersey of the NEP Ministry, because you know we realized already before the pandemic hit that you know we were on a you know riding train, continuously working, you know, for the community, for the bigger cause, part of the movement. You know, almost everything we did was focused on either the movement or the Black Archives, which partly led to burnouts and you know people getting exhausted. And even after that, during the pandemic, we continued, you know, working on that level. And it literally took, you know, the pandemic to develop and the government to, you know, issue a lockdown for us to, you know, stop for a moment and really take time, rest, reflect. And I really liked, yeah, the work of this lady. She calls herself the NEP Minister. It's a podcast and, you know, writes essays in which she, yeah, reflects on how, you know, this way of working, of this way of living, of always being productive, is also rooted in the history of capitalism and white supremacy. Because you know the system of capitalism wants us to continue to work, to grind, and you know to always be active. And that's also something I see a lot in both in the art scene, in the art world, and especially also in grassroots movements. So yeah, one of the things we've been thinking about is how can we develop a way of working and living which is more sustainable both for, you know, as a collective and as individuals. And another thing that was very interesting for us, I showed you a few pictures of the protests of last year, Black Lives Matter protests. You know, there were record numbers of people who showed up. And yeah, I believe that also had to do with the fact that people had to be still for a while, because it happened right after the first quote unquote lockdown in the Netherlands. June 1st was the first day that people were allowed to, you know, move a bit again. And yeah, the lockdown really forced people to be still, be at home. And, you know, there was less distraction of, you know, parties and sports and all kinds of materialistic things. And yeah, that really led to interesting situations where, you know, some people were meditating, engaging in all kinds of interesting situations and reflecting on, you know, how a lot of issues in the world are interconnected. So yeah, I think it has been an interesting period. Unfortunately, seems like people have adapted again and are back in the rat race, or a lot of people. But what we do try to remain, you know, find a better balance.
I think I would like to say a little bit more about what's happening in my side of the world. I should have said earlier that the Transnational Coalition for the Arts was recently launched in April 4 to stand in solidarity with our colleagues and friends, artists in Myanmar. And we've been launching a series of campaigns on social media, particularly recently, to support and ask governments all over the world to recognize and acknowledge the National Unity Government of Myanmar. And we're hoping that as soon as the campaign for Myanmar is sustained, then we will focus our campaign on what's happening in the Philippines.
I guess from there, I want to ask, maybe it sounds like a naive question, but do you all feel like, from your own respective situations and also networks, that there has been a turn towards more transnational alliances or various community alliances in the past year, either as a result of this or various other forces at hand? I'm curious.
Historically, solidarity movements have been working even during the time of the Marcos dictatorship. I think the contribution of international alliances to the struggle for democracy against the dictatorial rule of the Marcos regime in the 80s was very, very significant. I think, almost all progressive movements all over the world would always align themselves with a country that is, going through dictatorial and militarist rule.
Yeah, I did. Mitchell, do you want to jump in? It's interesting, at least in some of the conversations early on, and Rachel, you would know about this as much, if not more than me. In the critical kind of curatorial arts, there was discussion about whether people should pull now that there's not this hyper locality, which we've been hearing about, which is, and Karrabing it's really hyper local, but not in a proprietary understand. So it works against that. But being able to move around into specific networks of conversation has been great for Karrabing to understand the way in which their very, very local practices are connected to these extra, which they know, but it's also working in solidarity, learning from others about the specific condition making that global capitalism, global racism, global colonialism make. So it was interesting when there was, in the beginning of the pandemic, there was this, at least in some places, talk about, we should now become local in the sense of it conflated flying and being, so I don't know how to even put it, but it was like, no, we shouldn't be flying around, therefore we should only think about where we are. And it was like, wait, we've conflated things.
We're stuck here.
Yeah, no, it was really super interesting. And then I think, of course, and I was really interested, Norberto, what you were saying, because these solidarities always go on, and through pandemics, through wars, we know that. And the conditions, though, are really, of course, are interestingly different because, say, here we are in Zoom, that the mediascapes both are open, but also controlled depending on where you are. And they're not only controlled from the state point of view, but say my colleagues in Australia, we talk all the time on, we talk all the time on text, and we talk all the time on Facebook, but no Zoom, no Skype, we don't have that, right? So it's got to be these, we critique Facebook up the wazoo, but Messenger, wow, that really allows us to continue to be in these networks. And so that part, I think, of the how, Norberto, of how we keep these alliances of solidarity going.
Yeah. I think in our context, I could definitely say that I did witness a sense of growth in terms of solidarity between different communities, both within the Netherlands and also partly transnationally. And yeah, since we've been active, of course, I can say most about that, but I think that moment of the Black Lives Matter protest movement, quite an impact. As I already showed, the number of people who showed up was pretty groundbreaking, because it included all kinds of people, and not just Black people fighting this anti-Black violence, but also a lot of young white people, a lot of older white people, a lot of people from different communities of color, also acknowledging the specific form of anti-Blackness in the Dutch context, which was quite interesting, because normally in the discourse, it's first of all, the Dutch context, I think race and racism are often kind of, people are very sensitive about it. So in general, people do not want to acknowledge that it's even an issue. So in that moment, you saw that, because of the large number of people and all of the media attention and the conversations that were going on, the discourse also shifted a bit. Even politicians acknowledged that institutional racism was a problem. And within the communities, the different forms of racism, such as anti-Blackness, were acknowledged and addressed as well. So there were different conversations being organized online via Zoom, Clubhouse, about anti-Blackness and communities of color, especially Muslim communities, and vice versa. So a few very interesting conversations have happened. The other side of this movement, I do think, is that there's sometimes this risk of like performative activism, especially on social media. It's quite easy to say you're in solidarity and share something, share a statement, which can definitely help. When we look, for example, at the Palestinian question, I think it's very helpful if as many as people speak out and show that their support. But do ask the question: is that enough? Is it enough to post one thing one day and then carry on with your lives? So sometimes it feels a bit performative. But yeah, in terms of locality versus global, the global narrative, I think with BLM you really saw a very interesting dynamic between what was happening globally, starting in the US, translated to the local meaning and context of anti-Blackness. So,
Michelle, I'm quite impressed with the Black archives, and I'm curious if you'll find information in your archive about an association that existed in the 80s or maybe even in late 70s, and the name of this global alliance is it's called Japan African Asian Latin American Artists Association. The acronym is JAALA, and a few of them came around in the Philippines to participate in an exhibition and to support the national democratic movement during that period. So there were Black artists and Latin American artists who were present in the Philippines.
Sounds fascinating. I can shortly respond. I did not come across it yet, at least not consciously, because we're still processing a lot of the documents. So yeah, I can look at it with this new information. Maybe I can see what I can say is that, and relating to what I just said, looking at the documents, the archival documents from that period, 1960s, 70s, and 80s, what I find interesting was that there was, a lot of international solidarity in a time where you could argue that we have much better means of communicating transnationally now.
Yeah.
And so they didn't have internet, Instagram, Facebook, email, and stuff like that, but there were very strong alliances and collaborations. And now it feels like, you know, we have much better means to communicate, but that sometimes also makes it maybe a little bit superficial.
Yeah, that's really,
So
yeah, Mitchell, that's really, super interesting, right? Because the necessity to get across, like, how do you actually compose in these networks of solidarity when it was harder in some ways to move communication around, and thus the effort was part of the practice. Like you practiced effort, and we practice ease sometimes too much, I think.
I'm going to unfortunately say that we will have to wrap it up here. I very much look forward to continuing this conversation. Such a great pleasure to see everybody, even though on screen. Nonetheless, really greatly looking forward to continue, and not just conversation, but really drawing those lines through practice of being together. And thank you again, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. That was great. Thank you.
Could I just add also our thanks? It has been really incredibly inspiring, this particular panel, Affective Protocols of Locality. And you saw yourself the various terms that were highlighted, among them infrastructure or distributed existences or hyperdispersion, but also sustainability of our practices. So we're taking a brief break. We'll be closing and restarting the Zoom. So please join us again at 1 o'clock. The panel then is entitled On Artistic Coalition and Institutional Communal Nodality. And the speakers are Adelite Husni Bey, Emeka Okereke, Rolando Vasquez, and Rosabilda Ikasa, and Anja Vaya, Varric Raccoon, and Gesida Sergar of Good School. So we'll see you in just about 10 minutes, same Zoom link, but we need to quickly sign off, and then we'll put it back up. Thank you all very much.